The sound carried first, a clean crack of wood meeting leather, the burst of cheers, and the rhythmic chant of a crowd. Behind a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, several hundred German prisoners of war stood watching, their uniforms faded, their boots powdered with dust. Beyond the fence stretched an American baseball diamond, bright, wide, alive. A local team of U.S. Army recruits was playing against a group of townsmen, and the stands were full of families. Women in sundresses, children waving flags, vendors selling Coca-Cola in glass bottles. The Germans stared as if looking at another planet. Music drifted from a jukebox outside the recreation hall. Swing and brass, the sound of a country untouched by ruin. A corporal leaned toward his comrade and whispered in disbelief, "They fight a world war, and they still have time for this?" Another prisoner, once an engineer from Hamburg, watched a truck drive past loaded with fresh bread and uniforms. He shook his head slowly. "Now I understand," he murmured. "They win because they live well." Inside the fences, they had been told America was decadent, lazy, distracted, soft. But that day, watching a game under the Texas sun, they began to see the terrifying truth. America's comfort wasn't a weakness at all. It was the foundation of its power, a civilization that could make pleasure efficient, industry invisible, and war almost effortless. When the war came to America's heartland. By the summer of 1944, the United States had become the world's most unexpected host. Across the Midwest, the South, and the Far West, more than 425,000 German prisoners of war were living inside barbed wire compounds scattered from Maine to Arizona. They harvested crops, built roads, worked in sawmills, and sang German marching songs in the evenings while American guards smoked nearby. For many, it was their first direct encounter with the industrial democracy their own propaganda had mocked as weak. They had been captured in North Africa, Sicily, and France, soldiers of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. Most had expected humiliation or brutality from their captors. Instead, they found order, abundance, and routine comfort. Food rations were generous, mail arrived regularly, and medical care was meticulous. It was not kindness born of sentiment, but of structure. America was obeying the Geneva Convention of 1929, and it did so with bureaucratic precision. Each camp was a small, self-contained world. Barracks lined in perfect rows, mess halls with electric lights, canteens stocked with cigarettes, and recreation fields groomed for baseball or soccer. To men who had grown up under rationing and ruin, the efficiency felt surreal. Even the smallest detail, the neat handwriting on meal charts, the endless supply of soap, hinted at something deeper than luxury. This was a nation that could afford to fight global war without giving up its civilian rhythm. Arrival in the land of plenty-most German POWs first saw America through the fog of the Atlantic, after long voyages aboard converted troop ships. When they landed in New York, Norfolk, or Boston, the first thing they noticed was the skyline, cities glowing at night, unbombed, untouched. The lights never went out, one recalled later. It was as if they did not know there was a war. Trains carried them inland under armed guard. As the cars rolled through farmlands and factory towns, they saw grain elevators, oil derricks, and endless convoys of trucks. On station platforms, civilians stood waiting. Not soldiers' families, but ordinary people in good clothes, smiling, holding newspapers, living normally. The POWs looked through the windows and wondered, how can a people so comfortable produce so much power? When they reached their assigned camps, Camp Swift, Texas, Camp Algona, Iowa, Camp McCain, Mississippi, Camp Papago Park, Arizona, the paradox deepened. The Americans greeted them with clipboards and coffee, not whips. They were deloused, issued uniforms stenciled PW, and assigned bunks in barracks heated by electric stoves. The showers worked. The food was hot. Every prisoner received soap, a towel, and a toothbrush. For men who had crossed deserts eating hard bread and black coffee, it was unthinkable. The Geneva Convention as strategy. The United States' treatment of POWs was not naive generosity. It was strategy. Washington understood that moral high ground was power. Treating German prisoners well encouraged reciprocal treatment of American captives, improved intelligence gathering, and projected confidence. It showed that democracy could remain organized even in war. The Office of the Provost Marshal General, OPMG, oversaw the entire system. Its rules were strict. POWs could work, but not in war industries. They must receive equal medical care to U.S. soldiers. They must be allowed recreation and education. To maintain morale, camps built libraries, theaters, and even bands. Some prisoners studied English or mechanical engineering through correspondence courses sponsored by the YMCA. Others played soccer tournaments that drew crowds of American spectators. Yet it was baseball, the quintessential American game that fascinated them most. The rhythm of the sport, teamwork, order, fair play, seemed to mirror the society that created it. To German eyes, it was warfare turned into ritual, a contest without cruelty where skill replaced domination, a civilization without scarcity. Everywhere they looked, the POWs saw abundance. Camp kitchens served meat 3 times a week, bread daily, and coffee without rationing. The canteens sold candy, shaving cream, postcards, and occasionally beer. Outside the fences, American towns buzzed with production. Women drove trucks, teenagers delivered milk, factories worked around the clock. But the civilian tone never broke. A former Luftwaffe sergeant later wrote, "In Germany, we had propaganda films of a decadent America. Jazz, crime, chaos. Then we saw jukeboxes, clean streets, children eating ice cream, and soldiers playing games. We realized decadence was discipline disguised as pleasure. The Germans had imagined a divided, distracted enemy. Instead, they found unity born of comfort. The ease of life didn't weaken Americans. It energized them. The same factories that made jukeboxes made aircraft radios. The same assembly lines that built automobiles now produced tanks. Luxury had become logistics." By the time 1944 turned to 1945, even hardened officers began to suspect that America's casual prosperity, the laughter, the music, the steady hum of production, was the true superweapon of the war. It was a society so stable it could turn entertainment into endurance. And that realization, quiet but devastating, would transform how many of them thought about power, ideology, and civilization itself inside the fences of normalcy. Each day inside the American POW camps followed a rhythm that, to German eyes, felt less like imprisonment and more like participation in some vast, well-oiled civilization. Reveille sounded at dawn, the bugle echoing through barracks lined with pine walls and iron bunks. Breakfast followed. Eggs, toast, jam, and coffee, not the watered gruel of military rationing in Europe. Then came roll call, work details, and, after the day's labor, something the prisoners found almost absurd: recreation. At Camp Algona in Iowa, prisoners built a full theater stage, complete with painted backdrops and floodlights, using lumber supplied by the U.S. Army. At Camp Hearn in Texas, they performed Beethoven and Wagner for local civilians. Others organized soccer tournaments or formed orchestras, borrowing instruments from nearby schools. But what truly astonished the Germans wasn't permission. It was provision. The guards encouraged them. Supplies were allocated, maintenance approved, even prizes offered for the best productions. It was cultural shock disguised as courtesy. They had been raised under a system where the state demanded sacrifice, where joy was rationed as tightly as fuel. Here, in enemy hands, joy was considered maintenance, a tool to keep men civilized. To them, it was both humiliating and hypnotic. The sound of civilization. Every evening, when the day's labor ended, the camps transformed. Radios crackled to life. Loudspeakers played American broadcasts. The Jack Benny Show, Glenn Miller's Orchestra, Bing Crosby. Sometimes, through the barbed wire, they heard laughter from the guards' mess hall or the rhythmic clink of jukeboxes spinning out swing tunes. The prisoners called it the sound of freedom. It was music that didn't march, didn't salute, didn't shout. It moved in arcs of melody, in confidence that needed no banners. For many of the younger prisoners raised on propaganda films of Aryan rigor, the soft rhythms of American jazz were as alien as the country itself. Unmilitary, spontaneous, happy. Yet it was that very lightness that disturbed them most. In the Reich, culture had been weaponized. Art, music, even architecture served ideology. Here, in the land of Coca-Cola and jukeboxes, art served leisure. And somehow, that leisure supported a war industry producing ships, tanks, and planes in numbers beyond imagination. Comfort had become a force multiplier. Nowhere was that paradox clearer than on the baseball field. The Americans played constantly. Soldiers, locals, even guards. The Germans watched with curiosity that slowly turned into fascination. At first, they saw the game as childish, men in uniforms chasing a ball. But as the innings passed, they began to see the hidden structure, the discipline, the timing, the balance between individuality and teamwork. In baseball, no single man won alone. The rhythm of the team determined the outcome. The rules were complex but fair, the authority absolute yet unquestioned. It mirrored what they saw everywhere in America: organized freedom. One POW sergeant said to his friend during a game at Camp Swift, "This game explains their factories." He meant it literally. Each worker performed his role like a player in the lineup. Independent, yet coordinated. The same society that could standardize a baseball glove could standardize a bomber. What they saw on that dusty diamond was not leisure distracting from war, but leisure reflecting it. Comfort as a doctrine. It took months, but the message sank in. What German officers had dismissed as American softness was actually industrial serenity. A culture so wealthy, so confident, it could treat comfort as infrastructure. Radios kept morale stable. Sports prevented rebellion. Music reminded men what peace could feel like. The system didn't control emotion by suppression, but by satisfaction. A prisoner at Camp McCain, Mississippi, wrote in his diary, "They have found a way to turn happiness into obedience." It was not meant as an insult. It was observation. America's secret weapon wasn't just its factories or its armies. It was its ability to mass-produce contentment, to make life at every level feel abundant and orderly. For men raised under scarcity, that abundance was spiritual disarmament. The realization spread. By late 1944, when German defeat was inevitable, many POWs began reevaluating everything they had believed. Some even volunteered for re-education programs, reading American newspapers and attending lectures about democracy. Not because they were coerced, but because they wanted to understand how a nation so relaxed could be so relentless. They watched guards return from leave with new cars while their own homeland starved. They saw civilian families visit camps bearing pies and postcards for prisoners. They saw prosperity without cruelty, a concept unthinkable in the totalitarian world they came from. One POW later summarized it in a letter home, censored, but fragments survived. America fights not with fear, but with comfort. Their soldiers dream of peace because they know peace is real. That insight, simple, profound, was the heart of the transformation. The baseball field and the jukebox had become classrooms. The prisoners were beginning to see that industrial democracy was not a contradiction, but a perfection of balance. Leisure without decay, order without tyranny. And soon that understanding would deepen, when they realized that the very abundance surrounding them, from food to music to sport, was the product of a national machinery that never truly slept, the shock of civilization. 4 views from behind the wire. By 1945, the American POW camps had become a living museum of ideology. Behind those fences stood the most disciplined army in Europe, stripped of its flags, forced to study a civilization it had tried to destroy. What they found was not weakness, but an economy of ease, a place where comfort, leisure, and abundance served the same purpose their Reich had assigned to willpower, fear, and sacrifice. Each group of prisoners reacted differently to this discovery. Soldiers, officers, intellectuals, and party loyalists all looked at the same jukeboxes, the same baseball games, and saw entirely different lessons. But together, their reactions painted one of the most profound cultural collisions of the 20th century. The common soldier, disarmed by decency, for the ordinary lancer, the frontline infantryman, life in the American camps was his first taste of civility since leaving home. These were farm boys from Bavaria, machinists from Hamburg, or miners from the Ruhr, men who had fought for years in mud and hunger, driven by propaganda that promised glory through hardship. At Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, guards routinely handed them newspapers, showed them movies, and even allowed them to form bands. The soldiers were bewildered. They had been told that Americans were soft, unprincipled materialists. Yet here, the soft enemy fed them meat, paid them wages for labor, and let them rest in safety while the Reich starved. One prisoner wrote home through the Red Cross, "The Americans do not need discipline like ours. Their comfort keeps them calm. Their soldiers smile because they do not fear their officers." That realization was more dangerous to Nazi morale than any leaflet drop. It told the common soldier that strength didn't have to come from suffering. It could come from stability. It was a quiet, devastating revelation. The officers. Envy behind pride. For captured Wehrmacht officers, especially those from the general staff, the American way of war was both fascinating and humiliating. They studied the camp's logistics, its routines, the efficiency of its supply chain. Everything, from the timing of the meals to the availability of baseball equipment, spoke of planning on an industrial scale. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, one captured colonel observed, "They mobilize their pleasures as we mobilize our soldiers." He wasn't being sarcastic. He was describing a civilization that had fused economy, morale, and production into one organism. The jukebox in the canteen wasn't entertainment. It was psychological lubrication. It kept workers happy, soldiers steady, and prisoners docile. America's comfort was strategic, an empire of morale. The officers began to see that the same factories that made bicycles and radios also produced tanks and bombers. Civilian life and military industry were not separate spheres. They were extensions of one another. Leisure wasn't the opposite of war effort. It was its fuel. "We mistook relaxation for decadence," one captured major admitted. It was efficiency disguised as pleasure. That line, later quoted by U.S. intelligence analysts, summed up the German officer corps' final epiphany. The Reich's model of strength had been rigid, brittle, self-consuming. America's model was fluid, adaptable, endlessly renewable. One collapsed under pressure, the other thrived because of it. Among the prisoners were academics, journalists, engineers, men who had once believed they understood the West. They had studied America through the lens of Nietzsche and Spengler, through caricatures of jazz, skyscrapers, and mass man. What they found in captivity shattered every preconception. At Camp Algona, the library was stocked with English and German books, Dickens, Twain, Goethe, even Einstein. The Americans encouraged reading, believing education to be both therapy and deterrent. To the German intellectuals, this was incomprehensible. In their world, knowledge had been militarized. In America, it was democratized. Anyone could read. Anyone could learn. One captured journalist, a former propagandist, confessed in a 1946 interview, "We thought democracy meant disorder, but here, even their chaos is organized." They watched townspeople visit the camps on weekends, smiling, curious, unafraid of the men who had bombed their allies. To them, that casual generosity was more frightening than hatred. It implied confidence, a moral surplus. They began to see that America's comfort was not moral decay, but moral security. The true believers, isolation in abundance. And yet, not everyone converted. The hardline Nazis inside the camps, the ideological loyalists, reacted with fury and denial. To them, the jukebox was corruption, baseball was chaos, and the comfort of their captors was decadence proven. They tried to recreate the Reich within the fences, forming secret groups, holding lectures, even enforcing obedience among fellow prisoners. But their control eroded daily, because no ideology survives laughter, and America, to their horror, was a laughing civilization. Guards joked. Radios played comedy. Civilians visited and treated the Germans as curiosities, not monsters. In that warmth, fanaticism froze. A sergeant who refused to join the Nazi inner circle wrote, "They told us comfort makes men weak, but it is I who have grown stronger here, because I have stopped hating." By war's end, those hardliners were the minority. The majority had been quietly reshaped by the camp's rhythm, by the sight of abundance functioning without arrogance. They had seen a civilization that made leisure productive, happiness disciplined, and humanity industrial. A civilization studied in reverse. The irony was not lost on them. These were men trained to fight modernity, now learning from it. Behind barbed wire, they saw what the Reich had missed. The true purpose of progress was not domination, but sustainability. America didn't need to shout about its greatness. It lived it, one hot meal and one baseball game at a time. When the war finally ended, many of those POWs went home with more than rations and stories. They carried blueprints in their minds, not of weapons, but of systems. And those systems, of logistics, morale, and comfort, would quietly influence post-war Europe more deeply than any ideology. The machinery of comfort, how leisure became a weapon. The German POWs, at first glance, the jukebox and the baseball field seemed trivial. But behind each of those symbols lay the full engine of American industry. That jukebox, playing swing music in a dusty Texas canteen, was a triumph of precision manufacturing. Electric motors, amplifiers, glasswork, and coin mechanisms all mass-produced in factories that also made radios for bombers and components for naval sonar. The baseball gloves the soldiers used were made on the same leather presses that produced flight jackets. The Coca-Cola bottles the POWs stared at came from the same bottling lines used to supply GIs from Normandy to New Guinea. To the Germans, these connections were staggering. In their world, civilian industry and military production were separate, the latter devouring the former until nothing remained. In America, both thrived simultaneously, feeding one another. Comfort wasn't a luxury, it was momentum. One captured engineer later wrote, "The same machine that gives them pleasure also gives them victory." He was right. The American genius was not merely to build. It was to build in peacetime for wartime, without changing the tempo of life. The music that never stopped. The jukebox was more than a machine. It was morale made mechanical. Swing music echoed through the camps at night. Benny Goodman, Duke Ellington, Glenn Miller, and even the prisoners began to hum along. They didn't understand the lyrics, but they understood the rhythm. It spoke of optimism, momentum, the easy certainty of a nation at peace with itself. To the Germans, this was an alien form of discipline, a rhythm without command. In their army, music served to march men toward death. In America's, it served to remind men what they were fighting to return to. Joy itself was a logistical asset. A prisoner wrote in his journal at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, "They dance while the world burns, and yet, by dancing, they win." The observation was not poetic exaggeration. It was an attempt to understand how a country could maintain national morale through rhythm, how even entertainment had been industrialized into a sustaining force. The factory that fed. Freedom German engineers in captivity often discussed America's production miracles. How could one nation produce more tanks, planes, and ships than the entire Axis combined, while still manufacturing refrigerators, records, and cars? They eventually realized the answer was cultural, not mechanical. American consumerism was pre-mobilized. The very habits that Germany had condemned as decadence, the appetite for goods, convenience, and leisure, had trained its citizens to think in terms of mass production, distribution, and demand. The U.S. didn't need to teach its workers to mobilize. It simply redirected their routines. The same logistics that delivered jukebox records to diners now delivered ammunition to the Pacific. The same railroads that carried Coca-Cola carried Sherman tanks. The national rhythm didn't change. It just amplified. The prisoners saw in America's comfort the secret of total war, efficiency without exhaustion. Its people didn't need propaganda to sacrifice. They needed reassurance that comfort would return, and they worked harder for it than fear could ever command. The cafeteria economy inside the camps, the POWs experienced a miniature version of the American system, a cafeteria world, as one German sociologist later called it. Choice, variety, and availability became the architecture of morale. Even under guard, they could see the pattern. People who are well-fed and well-entertained obey willingly because they believe in the structure feeding them. Meals arrived on time. The lights stayed on. The sports fields were maintained. To German eyes, it was a machine running without visible coercion. The Reich had ruled by fear. The United States ruled by satisfaction. And that satisfaction, mechanized, distributed, scaled, was the most advanced form of control they had ever seen. They do not command order, one prisoner remarked. They grow it. That insight was so profound that post-war sociologists would later trace its echoes in Germany's Reconstruction, where industrial welfare, corporate cafeterias, and modern social services took shape under the influence of those American systems. The paradox of plenty. In the final months of the war, as Germany starved, the POWs read U.S. newspapers full of advertisements. Buy bonds. Keep 'em flying. Victory gardens. Your comfort is their strength. It was propaganda, yes, but propaganda rooted in comfort, not suffering. The enemy was being defeated by a nation that didn't martyr itself. That idea haunted them, because the Reich had promised salvation through deprivation, through struggle and self-denial. America promised victory through production, through satisfaction and abundance. The contrast was total. One ideology made its people harder until they broke. The other made its people comfortable until they outlasted everyone else. They have built an empire where happiness is efficiency, a German officer observed. We built one where obedience was misery. That is the difference. Comfort as the true arsenal of democracy by 1945, the German prisoners had come to a collective conclusion that would later define much of post-war Europe. Comfort is not the opposite of strength. It is the form strength takes in an advanced civilization. They had seen a nation that could fight across 2 oceans while still delivering ice cream, baseball games, and music to its people. They had seen a war machine that ran not on tyranny but on thermostats, jukeboxes, and blue-collar faith. When some of those prisoners later became engineers, industrial planners, and economists in the new West Germany, they carried those lessons home. It was no coincidence that the economic miracle of the 1950s, the Volkswagen factories, the appliances, the welfare state, resembled the same synthesis of prosperity and productivity they had first witnessed behind American wire. Behind the barbed wire, the Germans had learned something their generals never had. The battlefield was only one front of modern war. The true contest was between ways of living, between a civilization that consumed itself to stay pure, and one that made comfort a weapon sharper than any sword. And soon, that realization would become personal, when these same prisoners returning home would help rebuild a defeated nation using the very principles of their captors. It was July 4th, 1945, Independence Day, in Camp Swift, Texas. The war in Europe was over. The heat shimmered above the red dirt, and the camp loudspeakers played "Don't Fence Me In." To the Americans, it was a day of celebration. To the German prisoners, it was a study in contradiction. They were surrounded by victory, Yet no one around them seemed cruel, vengeful, or even particularly triumphant. The Americans simply enjoyed themselves. Inside the wire, guards set up a baseball game. On the mound, a corporal from Kansas wound up and threw a perfect pitch. The crowd, soldiers, civilians, even some off-duty officers, cheered under the striped awnings. Beyond the fence, the German POWs gathered to watch, still wearing their faded field uniforms marked PW. But this time, they were not watching out of boredom. They were watching as men witnessing something they couldn't quite define. At first, it was the music that drew them. The bandstand playing swing tunes, brass and rhythm rolling across the Texas dust. Then came the smell. Roasted meat, corn, fresh bread. Barrels of lemonade stood in the shade. Children chased each other between picnic tables while soldiers tossed gloves and laughed. Every element of the day, the order, the sound, the ease, was foreign to men who had spent years in a Europe of ruins. A German officer leaned against the fence and muttered to no one in particular. In Germany, such a celebration would have taken 6 weeks of planning and 1,000 speeches. Here, it seemed effortless. The celebration of effortlessness. The Americans weren't performing for the prisoners. They barely noticed them. The game, the music, the laughter. It was simply life continuing. The Germans realized that the same force that built bombers also built barbecues, that the same system that supplied the Pacific Fleet also delivered ice for drinks on a holiday afternoon. To them, it was unthinkable. They had fought a war where comfort was forbidden, where pleasure was treason, where every ounce of production was bled dry for the front. Here, in the land of plenty, pleasure itself seemed to fuel the machinery. An older POW, a former engineer from Stuttgart, whispered to a younger one beside him, "Look at them. They do not sacrifice to be strong. They are strong because they have no need to sacrifice." That line passed quietly through the crowd of prisoners, not as admiration, but as revelation. They had just seen the essence of American power, not steel or tanks, but surplus. The power to enjoy, to produce, to share, even in the middle of war. A visit from the colonel later that afternoon, an American camp commandant, Colonel Robert E. Pierce, arrived to deliver a brief address to his men. He spoke not of victory, but of gratitude. He thanked the cooks, the guards, the quartermasters, and the mechanics who kept the camp running. Every man's contribution, he said, was part of the same machine. The POWs, listening through translators, recognized as the sun went down, the guards switched on the floodlights around the baseball field. The POWs watched in stunned silence as the bulbs glowed to life. Hundreds of them, bright and flawless. The field became a stage of light. Then came the fireworks. Bursts of color arced into the Texas sky, each explosion reflected in the lenses of the prisoners' glasses. One prisoner murmured, "We can't even light our streets, and they light the heavens." He wasn't bitter. He was awed. The power that illuminated that field was the same power that had turned Detroit into an arsenal and Chicago into a furnace of supply. Every rocket burst over Texas was an echo of the same industrial energy that had broken the Reich. When a group of soldiers near the fence offered the Germans lemonade through the wire, several accepted. No threats, no mockery, just a human gesture in a sea of machinery. One of the older officers took the glass, hesitated, then raised it slightly in salute. "To your factories," he said in English. The guard smiled. "To freedom," he replied. The quiet conversion. That night, the camp was quiet except for the faint sound of swing music from the canteen jukebox. Inside the barracks, the German prisoners lay awake, their minds full of conflicting images: destroyed cities and laughing children, ration books and jukeboxes, dictatorship and dancing. They realized that the true defeat of the Reich had not come from firebombs or invasions. It had come from a nation that had made joy its infrastructure. They had been trained to see pleasure as weakness. But here, in captivity, they discovered that pleasure could be a form of discipline more powerful than fear. In his diary, one German NCO wrote the next morning, "I have seen the machine that beat us. It is not the bomber or the tank. It is the store, the home, the song, and the game." the day America celebrated its freedom, the prisoners understood, perhaps more clearly than any general, what kind of world they had tried to conquer and why it had been impossible. But the revelation would not end there. In the months that followed, as they worked in American towns and factories, they would see up close how that same system, cheerful, efficient, and endless, was rebuilding the very world they had helped destroy. When work revealed the war machine beneath the comfort. By late August 1945, the war had officially ended, but for the German prisoners scattered across America, the lessons were only beginning. The guns had fallen silent in Europe, yet inside the vast American heartland, another kind of war continued. A war of production, rebuilding, and rhythm. And for the first time, the former soldiers of the Reich were allowed to step directly into the machinery that had beaten them. At Camp Huntsville, Texas, and Camp Algona, Iowa, POWs were assigned to labor detachments on nearby farms and factories. They rode in military trucks past endless highways, grain silos, neon-lit diners, and filling stations, scenes that looked ordinary to Americans, but surreal to men who had spent years in a collapsing Europe. Every intersection seemed to hum with quiet confidence. Gasoline flowed freely, radios played jazz in every store, and refrigerators, those gleaming symbols of American plenty, were everywhere. When they arrived at their work sites, they saw the system up close. The factory without fatigue, at a small machine parts plant in Illinois, a group of captured engineers and mechanics from the Africa Corps found themselves helping with non-military production, fixing tractors, repairing tools, sorting steel. What they saw shocked them. The assembly lines ran smoothly, almost lazily. Workers chatted, smiled, even took breaks with coffee and pie. And yet the numbers, the sheer output, dwarfed anything German industry had achieved under the lash of discipline. One prisoner noted in his logbook, "They work 8 hours and achieve what we did in 16. They whistle. They listen to radios. But the machines never stop." The realization struck like revelation. America's power didn't come from overwork. It came from organization. Every bolt, every minute, every calorie was accounted for, planned, and integrated into a system designed to sustain itself indefinitely. The Reich had burned itself alive on the altar of sacrifice. America had built an economy that ran on efficiency wrapped in ease. When the foreman handed the prisoners cold lemonade during their shift, one of them, a former officer, couldn't resist saying, "In Germany, we would have been whipped for drinking on duty." The foreman laughed. "That's why you lost," he said, and walked away. The prisoner never forgot those words. The farms that fed an army and a continent elsewhere. On vast farms across Kansas and Nebraska, POWs worked side by side with American farmers, plowing, harvesting, and bundling hay under the same unrelenting sun. What struck them wasn't the labor itself, but the machinery. Tractors with wide tires, automatic threshers, irrigation pumps powered by electricity. They had grown up on hand tools and horse-drawn wagons. Here, every machine seemed built for permanence. At the end of a long day, when the farmers invited them for dinner, they sat at tables covered with fresh bread, vegetables, and milk so abundant it felt obscene. The farmer's wife would bring pies, and the radio would play the evening news. Stories of Japan's surrender, of GIs returning home, of peace. And all the while, trains rumbled in the distance. Grain trains, oil trains, supply trains, as if the whole continent was still in motion. To the Germans, it was another kind of army, an army of comfort. Every house, every kitchen, every field was part of the same front. One POW, once a staff sergeant, wrote in his diary, "Now I see why we starved. They fight with their kitchens." He wasn't mocking. He was recognizing that America's true arsenal wasn't the factory floor or the battlefield. It was the living standard itself, the confidence that everyone would eat, everyone would work, everyone would rest. No propaganda could compete with that. The towns that never slept. Every weekend, some camps allowed prisoners to work under minimal guard in nearby towns, painting barns, fixing fences, cutting timber. It was then that they saw what the propaganda had hidden from them. Ordinary Americans lived better in wartime than most Europeans did in peace. Supermarkets brimmed with produce. Shops overflowed with clothes and radios. Movie theaters ran 3 shows a night. A group of Luftwaffe mechanics stationed near Camp Atterbury, Indiana, once helped repair a cinema's projection system. The owner, grateful, let them stay to watch the film. Casablanca. When the lights dimmed and the piano on screen began playing As Time Goes By, one of the prisoners, barely 20, began to cry. "We destroyed cities to prove we were strong," he whispered. "And this is what strength looks like." It wasn't sentimentality. It was cultural shock. They had been raised in a world where art and pleasure served ideology. In America, art and pleasure served life. Near the end of their labor term, a group of POWs at Camp Swift were invited, unofficially, quietly, by a local farmer to join a community dance. They sat at the back of the hall while townsfolk twirled to the music of a glowing jukebox. Then something remarkable happened. The farmer's daughter walked over and placed a coin in the slot. The machine whirred, and Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade began to play. The crowd clapped. Someone turned to the prisoners and said, "You can dance too, if you like." For a moment, no one moved. Then one German stood, hesitated, and took the hand of a local girl. The others followed. Laughter rippled through the room, soft and genuine. That night, for a few minutes, the war ended not in politics or surrender documents, but in rhythm, in the realization that this civilization, for all its abundance, had preserved its humanity. Later, back in camp, a prisoner scribbled in his notebook, "We fought to conquer modernity. Instead, modernity conquered us, with light, music, and kindness." That was the night their understanding crystallized. The arsenal of democracy was not just the bombers, the tanks, or the guns. It was the jukebox glowing in a diner, the baseball diamond lit by electricity, the factory that never tired because its workers were never broken. They saw, finally, that America's war machine was not a thing of iron, but a way of life, a culture that made strength comfortable, progress pleasurable, and freedom efficient. When the prisoners became students of civilization. The war was over. But for the hundreds of thousands of German POWs scattered across the United States, 1946 was not a year of return. It was a year of realization. The barbed wire no longer symbolized punishment. It had become a classroom. When repatriation finally began, the trains rolled east through cities still glowing with neon and factory smoke: Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis. The prisoners pressed their faces to the glass and watched an industrial empire move in perfect rhythm. Freight cars stacked with machines, women in overalls walking to night shifts, schoolchildren eating ice cream on corners lined with posters that read, "Work today for peace tomorrow." To men whose homeland was a cratered ruin, the sight was unbearable and unforgettable. They understood, as few ever would, that they were leaving the civilization that had mastered modernity, not through tyranny or terror, but through comfort and cooperation. America had turned ordinary life itself into the ultimate weapon. The ships carrying them back to Europe were quiet. On deck, the prisoners looked out over the Atlantic and spoke softly about what they had seen. "They don't fear their leaders," said one. "They trust their system." Another replied, "Because the system works." Many still carried notebooks, sketches of machines, notes on production processes, lists of materials they had never seen before: plastics, aluminum alloys, air-conditioned warehouses. Others wrote about the people, the friendliness, the equality, the casual wealth. They were returning not only with memories, but with data. Fragments of an idea that would soon shape a nation's rebirth. A ruined homeland. When they reached Bremen or Hamburg, the contrast was biblical. Entire cities lay in ashes. The streets smelled of smoke and hunger. Women pushed carts filled with rubble. The ration was 200 calories a day, half what a prisoner had received in America. "We are the prisoners now," one of them murmured as he stepped off the train. But amid the devastation, something unexpected stirred. A quiet resolve, a determination not to rebuild the old world but to imitate the new one. They had seen the future in captivity. It was efficient, democratic, and alive. The quiet missionaries of modernity. In the years that followed, many of those former POWs became engineers, factory managers, and city planners in the emerging Federal Republic of Germany. They were scattered across every industry: steel, textiles, transport, and nearly all of them carried the same conviction. Germany would survive not by conquest, but by competence. They introduced American-style management, time-study methods, and production lines based on what they had witnessed in U.S. plants. They insisted on workplace cafeterias, recreation for workers, and welfare programs, the same comfort infrastructure that had kept the American machine humming through the war. One former prisoner who later directed a steelworks near Essen famously said, "We do not need whip or ideology. We need hot meals, bright lights, and pride in doing something well." It sounded mundane, but it was revolutionary. The philosophy that had once humiliated them became the blueprint for the Wirtschaftswunder, the West German economic miracle. America as model, not master in post-war debates, these ex-POWs often clashed with older generals and ideologues who wanted to restore hierarchy and hardness. They argued for the opposite, for soft power, social trust, and living standards that made obedience voluntary. They had learned that a nation runs best when its people believe comfort is a right earned by work, not a weakness to be ashamed of. By 1950, as Marshall Plan aid poured in, they were ready. They knew how to translate abundance into structure, because they had seen it done in every camp kitchen, every baseball field, every factory floor. When American advisors arrived to guide Reconstruction, they found eager students, not resentful captives. "We had studied their civilization through fences," one recalled. "Now we were free to build our own version of it." From captivity to cooperation, the same men who had once been guarded by American soldiers now worked alongside them, rebuilding bridges, power stations, and industries. Some returned to the United States in the 1950s as visiting engineers or exchange students. Others kept the memory alive through books and interviews. When asked what had impressed them most, their answers were never about weapons. They spoke, instead of small, ordinary miracles: clean water, plentiful food, music on the radio, light that never failed. "In the camps," one wrote, "I saw that a civilization is not measured by how it kills its enemies, but by how it maintains its daily life in war." That idea, born behind fences, became the foundation of post-war Western Europe's identity. The belief that prosperity is peace and that comfort, properly organized, is the greatest defense against tyranny. But not all who returned could reconcile the past with what they had learned. Some faced ridicule for praising the enemy. Others carried guilt, that they had found enlightenment only through defeat. Still, their legacy would endure. They had seen the blueprint of modern freedom up close and would spend their lives recreating it, brick by brick, factory by factory. The conversion of a nation from obedience to comfort. By 1948, the miracle was underway. Germany, divided, humiliated, and starving, was beginning to hum again. Not with marches or speeches, but with the rhythm of machines. In workshops, from Hamburg to Stuttgart, engineers who had once been POWs in Texas or Iowa began applying what they had seen behind American fences. They spoke softly of a new creed: discipline without fear, order without hunger, progress without pain. Factories of dignity in Essen, a former Wehrmacht officer turned industrial planner, once a prisoner at Camp Swift, redesigned an entire steel mill. He introduced 8-hour shifts, canteens with hot meals, and a recreation hall with music during lunch. The older foreman called it soft, but production soared by 30% within a year. In Hamburg, another ex-POW insisted that the workers' cafeteria serve coffee and fresh bread every morning. When asked why, he replied, "Because I saw how America fought a world war without ever missing breakfast." This was no sentimental imitation. It was strategic. They had learned that morale was an industrial resource. A fed worker was an efficient worker. A rested citizen was a reliable one. They no longer believed in conquest. They believed in competence. The ideology that had once glorified sacrifice was quietly being replaced by one that glorified stability. Comfort became the new form of discipline. The birth of the Wirtschaftswunder. When the Marshall Plan began in 1948, America sent machines, trucks, and advisors. But what made the aid succeed was the mindset already planted in those returned prisoners. They knew the rhythm of American production, the layout of its factories, the logic of its consumer markets. They had seen a civilization that turned abundance into order, where even leisure was designed with precision. They applied that knowledge to rebuild West Germany's cities. Apartment blocks featured modern kitchens, tiled bathrooms, electric light. Streets were widened for cars, reflecting an American belief in mobility as freedom. Radios filled the air with swing and jazz, the same music that had once played through camp loudspeakers. By 1955, just 10 years after total collapse, West Germany had become Europe's industrial powerhouse. Reporters called it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Few realized that part of its DNA had been shaped thousands of miles away, in quiet American prison camps. The change was deeper than economics. It was psychological. The Germans, who had once worshipped austerity, now valued comfort as civic virtue. "We must never again equate misery with strength," said a former officer-turned-union leader in 1952. "A nation that feeds its people will never need to conquer." Music halls reopened, cinemas glowed, and cafes filled with laughter. These were not distractions. They were proof that civilization had survived. The young men who had watched Americans play baseball now cheered for soccer under floodlights. The women who had once rationed bread now queued for washing machines and radios. For the first time in their history, Germans were learning how to live without apologizing for comfort. Even architecture changed. The new buildings were wide, bright, efficient, designed not to intimidate, but to accommodate. Glass replaced stone. Transparency replaced monumentality. "A building should make life easier," said one architect who had worked in a POW labor detachment in Kansas. "That's what I learned from the Americans. Not style, but purpose." The psychological break from the Reich knot. Everyone accepted the change. Some older veterans called it moral surrender, the loss of discipline, the softening of the German spirit. But the younger generation, raised among ruins and jazz, saw it differently. They had witnessed where fanaticism led. To them, comfort was resistance. One ex-prisoner summarized the transformation bluntly in a 1956 interview. "We once believed pain made us pure. Now we know comfort makes us civilized." That sentence captured the essence of post-war West Germany. The ideals of efficiency, prosperity, and social welfare that defined the nation's new identity were not born solely from Marshall Plan money or foreign pressure. They were born from observation, from the long, humbling study of a society that had mastered the art of organized happiness. The long shadow of the jukebox by the early 1960s, the children of those returned POWs were growing up in a world of television, automobiles, and consumer confidence, the same forces that had once stunned their fathers. The jukebox had become the radio, the baseball field had become the soccer pitch, and the cafeteria had become the canteen of the modern welfare state. Everywhere one looked, traces of that American revelation remained. Clean streets, punctual. trains, and a quiet faith that comfort was not corruption, but civilization itself. The lesson of captivity had become the ethic of freedom. We learned, one elderly engineer said decades later, that liberty is not chaos. It is a well-lit factory and a warm meal. The transformation was complete. The men who had once watched baseball through fences had reshaped a nation by imitation, proving that sometimes the most enduring victories are cultural, not military. And yet, even after decades of prosperity, many of them would still close their eyes and remember the sound that had changed everything. A bat striking a ball, a jukebox spinning a tune, and the low hum of a civilization that never stopped moving forward, the civilization that fought with comfort. In the end, the lesson was not written in steel or blood, but in light. The men who had watched jukeboxes glow and baseballs arc through Texas dusk understood something their generals never had. That true power is not the ability to destroy, but the ability to endure without cruelty. America had fought the most mechanized war in history without becoming mechanical. Its factories worked like clockwork, but its citizens laughed, sang, danced, and played. Comfort did not weaken the nation. It sustained it. Every refrigerator, every radio, every movie theater was proof that life could continue amid global chaos, that joy itself could be industrialized. For the German prisoners, that discovery was civilization's quiet revelation. They had been taught that modernity corrupts and that leisure softens the soul. Yet in captivity, they